He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just watched, like he was waiting for the world to hurt him again. The road out of Helena curved through pine-covered hills and open stretches of empty sky, where silence held steady like a second presence in the truck. Ethan drove without speaking, the hum of the engine the only sound between him and the dog in the back. They hadn't named him yet. They didn't need to. What mattered was that the dog was alive, pulled from the side of a road near an abandoned military facility with scars that weren't just physical. No tags, no chip. Just a look in his eyes that said he remembered everything. Sarah, seated beside Ethan, reviewed the intake photos. Each image told more than the reports ever could. Scars from embedded harness lines, cracked teeth from impact trauma, a right ear that had been half torn and healed without treatment. Claire, their vet, had said quietly, "He didn't just survive, he adapted." That was what haunted them. The dog hadn't fought the system. He'd endured it, and somewhere along the way, he'd learned how to stop reacting to pain. When they arrived at the ranch, Ethan didn't open the gate right away. He parked just outside and waited. The dog looked through the window, but didn't move. No pacing, no whining, just stillness. Then slowly he stepped out, his body cautious but composed. He didn't bolt or cower, he scanned. His eyes flicked toward the barn, then the fence line, then to Ethan. It was the look of someone calculating exits before deciding whether to stay. They didn't put him in the kennels. He wouldn't have understood that kind of confinement anymore. Instead, they cleared the old feed room and made it his space. Soft bedding, clean water, nothing forced. Claire sat nearby as he explored, making no moves to touch him. Sarah monitored from a distance. Ethan watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. For the first 2 hours, the dog never lay down. He just stood, alert, breathing evenly, watching everything. Then, just before sunset, he curled into the corner facing the door. Not asleep, never asleep. Just resting, eyes open, one ear tilted slightly toward sound. That night, Ethan sat outside under the stars, the air cold but familiar. The ranch was quiet. Dogs stirred in their kennels. Wind moved through the trees. He thought of how many like this one had been discarded, too unstable to serve, too damaged to adopt, trained to survive but not to live. And this dog, whoever he had once been, had slipped through that net with nothing left but his body and his memory. Ethan didn't cry. He rarely did, but he felt something settle inside him, a sense of purpose sharper than anger, quieter than grief. They started calling him Shadow. It wasn't official, just instinctual. The name fit the way he moved, the way he watched without being seen, the way he hovered just out of reach, yet never out of sight. Sarah logged it into the files. Claire wrote it on the feeding chart. Ethan carved it into a scrap of wood and nailed it to the corner of the feed room. Shadow didn't respond to it, not at first, but over the next few days when someone said it softly, his ears would flick, just barely. The scars would take time, the trust even more. But Shadow was there, breathing, watching, not broken, just waiting for the world to prove it wouldn't hurt him again. In the early days, Shadow didn't bark. He didn't whimper or growl or react to sudden movement. He simply existed, watching, tracking, breathing. He knew the difference between silence and safety, and he treated noise like a variable to be measured. When other dogs barked, he didn't respond. When food was placed down, he waited, eyes on the door, eating only when the space felt untouched. He moved with the precision of someone who'd had choice trained out of him and was now remembering what it felt like to have it again. Ethan noticed everything. Shadow didn't sleep deeply, never turned his back to the door, and paced in straight lines before settling. Not erratic pacing, but mapped, calculated like patrols. The vet reports confirmed old injuries but no recent trauma, yet Ethan knew the real damage wasn't visible. It lived in the dog's restraint, in the way he hesitated before drinking, the way he scanned people for hidden meaning behind their movements. Sarah had started tracking behavior patterns. How long it took for Shadow to make eye contact. How many minutes he stayed in the open before retreating to the corner of the feed room. Her notes read less like data and more like puzzle pieces. Claire, meanwhile, ran non-invasive tests, joint stiffness, old scar tissue, reaction to light and sound, and noted that his vitals were strong. But she added a line at the bottom of her report that stayed with Ethan. This dog has been professionally broken. Now he's building himself back. One morning, as mist hovered low across the pasture, Ethan opened the feed room without a sound. Shadow looked up but didn't move. Ethan crouched slowly, keeping his eyes just off center. Not a direct stare, not submissive, balanced. He laid a treat on the floor and backed away. Shadow didn't take it immediately. 10 minutes passed. Then he approached, took the treat gently, and returned to his place without turning his back. Trust wasn't given. It was earned in fractions. By the end of the first week, Shadow began stepping outside the feed room at dawn. Never far, just to the porch and back. Claire caught it first, watching from the barn. His movements were clean, precise, like he was measuring space. Sarah started setting up a motion-activated camera, capturing hours of silent footage. Watching it later, she saw how he paused at thresholds, how he avoided casting long shadows across walls, how he moved along edges rather than across open ground. Trained behavior, taught for stealth, but now used out of habit, not command. No one gave him orders. No one touched him. They let him set the terms. And slowly the pattern changed. He began watching people work, standing at a distance as Claire fed the others, observing Sarah walk the perimeter with her clipboard, watching Ethan fix the same loose gate each morning. It wasn't about curiosity, it was orientation. Shadow was learning the land the same way he had once learned terrain in another life, quietly, deliberately, without letting on how much he was understanding. One night, long after the others had gone to bed, Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold. He didn't expect company, but then he heard a soft shuffle behind him and turned to see Shadow sitting at the porch's edge. Not close, but not far either. Ethan said nothing. He didn't move. They sat like that for a while, two figures shaped by different kinds of silence, both learning to trust the quiet again. In that moment, Ethan didn't feel hope exactly. It was something quieter than that, something steadier. It was the sense that healing had already begun, and that it would come not in milestones, but in the steady repetition of moments just like this one. The days stretched into a quiet routine, where change wasn't marked by sudden breakthroughs, but by subtle shifts. Shadow began walking the perimeter of the ranch just before dawn, moving in slow, methodical circles as though redrawing boundaries he could finally believe in. He didn't interact with the other dogs. He didn't challenge them or avoid them. He simply existed on a parallel track, present but apart. Ethan watched from the window each morning, tracking his progress like a quiet ritual. The dog wasn't pacing out of anxiety. He was scanning, remembering. It was muscle memory being repurposed for something new. Claire noted it in her logs, how Shadow's gait had improved, how the stiffness in his joints had eased. He still flinched at certain tones, especially deep male voices from behind, but he no longer crouched or hid. When Ethan accidentally dropped a tool from the porch railing and it hit the steps, Shadow didn't bolt. He turned sharply, tense for a second, then held his ground. That was the moment Ethan knew the dog had started to reclaim his instinct, not to obey, not to fear, but to assess on his own terms. Sarah had begun gathering more background information, pulling threads from declassified military training logs and connecting dots between K-9 decommissioning cases and off-the-record facilities. What they had long suspected was slowly becoming something else, evidence, but they were cautious. What mattered more than proof was protection. Shadow wasn't a headline, he was a survivor, and everything about him had to be handled with the same precision he had once been trained to execute. One afternoon, a storm rolled in quickly from the north, darkening the sky and rattling windows. Thunder cracked loud enough to shake the barn doors. Dogs barked from their kennels. Shadow didn't join them. He stood in the middle of the yard, head lifted, body stiff. Ethan stepped outside, heart in his throat, ready to intervene. But Shadow didn't panic. He didn't retreat. He turned slowly and walked toward the porch, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped just short of the door, sat, and waited. Ethan opened it and let him in without a word. The storm passed. Shadow stayed. From that night forward, something in his routine shifted. He still walked the perimeter, still kept to his patterns, but now he ended each loop near the porch, resting just beneath the steps, close enough to hear footsteps inside the house. He began accepting his meals near people, lifting his head when Claire approached, even leaning slightly toward her hand one afternoon before stepping away again. It was tentative, but real. Progress wasn't always visible to the untrained eye, but to those who had seen what trauma could do, it was unmistakable. Ethan sat beside him more often now, on the porch, by the trail, sometimes near the barn. He didn't talk much. He didn't have to. Shadow wasn't a dog that needed words. He needed rhythm, and Ethan had learned to offer it without asking for anything in return. They shared space. That was enough. In one of her reports, Sarah wrote, "His memory is not the problem, it's the proof." And she was right. Shadow hadn't forgotten what had been done to him, but he had survived it. And now, slowly, he was showing them all that survival didn't have to mean isolation. It could mean returning to the same ground over and over again until it felt like home. As Shadow's presence deepened into the rhythm of the ranch, the outside world began inching closer to their quiet sanctuary. Sarah's digging had started turning up more than fragments. She uncovered budget trails that led to private contractors, vague reports of behavioral recalibration protocols, and mention of K9 units deemed non-compliant being transferred off record. There were too many missing dogs, too many abrupt disappearances explained by vague terms like euthanized due to aggression or unfit for reintegration, and Shadow, quiet, measured, alert, fit too cleanly into the pattern. He wasn't a one-off case. He was a thread to a much larger story. Claire started compiling a parallel record of her own. Medical scans, behavioral notes, physical responses to environmental stimuli, all documented with precision. Shadow's reactions were consistent with neurological trauma, but not the kind that comes from a single incident. These were layers, repeated overexposure to stress, overstimulation, and correction without recovery. And yet, he wasn't broken. His stillness wasn't emptiness. It was calculation. Even in his rest, he was tracking. Ethan knew the signs. He had seen them before, not in dogs, but in soldiers, the ones who came home intact on the outside but couldn't make noise feel safe again. Shadow walked like someone who had been punished for making mistakes no one explained. He moved like someone who had been hurt for reacting to fear. And now, in a place where nothing was demanded, he was figuring out how to exist again without apology. The ranch, once a closed loop of rescue and recovery, was shifting. Other handlers started reaching out. Former military K9 trainers, civilian adopters who had taken in retired dogs and couldn't understand their behavior. One woman wrote about a dog named Bishop who refused to walk on grass, only moving across concrete like it was a training floor. Another man reported a shepherd who growled at children but flinched when touched. The stories overlapped. Different places, same outcomes. Sarah collected them all. Ethan wasn't sure what they were building yet. Not a case, not a movement. Something quieter, something slower. A reckoning maybe, or a record. Shadow, without knowing it, had become the anchor of that record. Not the loudest, but the one who proved that silence could carry memory deeper than any outcry ever could. Late one evening, as the air turned cool and the sky shifted from gold to ash, Claire walked the trail alone and returned to find Shadow sitting outside her clinic door. Not pacing, not waiting, just sitting. She opened the door slowly, stepped out, and sat beside him. No leash, no commands, just presence. After a few minutes, Shadow rested his head on the wooden steps, and Claire didn't move. That night, Ethan walked the perimeter one last time. He passed the barn, the fence, the small fire pit near the trailhead. When he returned to the porch, Shadow was there, eyes open, tail still. Ethan sat beside him and leaned back into the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Somewhere inside the house, a kettle clicked off. Shadow didn't flinch. The noise hadn't stopped, but now he didn't fear it. He had finally learned the difference between the noise that hurts and the noise that just passes. Shadow's progress wasn't measured in tricks or obedience. He never learned to sit on command, never gave a paw, never chased a ball thrown with expectation. What he gave instead was something more subtle, more sacred. He chose presence. He chose proximity. And for a dog who had likely been trained to follow orders without hesitation, the act of choosing, without pressure, was its own kind of revolution. Ethan noticed it most in the mornings. Shadow would wait at the edge of the porch until Ethan stepped out, then follow a few paces behind as they moved across the fields. No leash, no voice cues, just mutual movement. Ash was still a pup then, only a few months into the rhythm of ranch life. He had energy that arrived in bursts and vanished just as quickly. But what made him different wasn't his speed, it was his observation. He watched everything Shadow did. If Shadow stopped, so did Ash. If Shadow sat near the barn, Ash would find a place nearby. And when Shadow chose to sleep closer to the porch rather than inside the feed room, Ash mirrored him within a day. It wasn't mimicry, it was imprinting in real time. Without commands, without correction. Claire noted the bond in her reports. She'd seen behavioral mimicry before, especially in packs, but this was more precise. Ash didn't just follow, he calibrated, and it became clear that Shadow wasn't rejecting connection. He was teaching it. Ethan called it the unspoken leash, the invisible tether between them that neither dog had asked for, but both honored. They moved in rhythm without ever being trained to. No one had shown them how, they had simply paid attention. Meanwhile, Sarah's documentation expanded. She began cross-referencing dates, matching euthanasia reports with missing training logs, building a picture of a program that operated under layers of silence. Some records were redacted, others were scrubbed entirely. But patterns were emerging, patterns of dogs pulled mid-service, moved to undisclosed locations, and never seen again. Shadow wasn't the exception. He was the result of something designed to disappear dogs who no longer performed the way funding models required. And now he was evidence that disappearance didn't mean erasure. One morning, a volunteer named Ellie arrived with her own rescue, a terrier mix named Max who had been labeled unmanageable by 3 previous shelters. Max barked at everything, shrieked at motion, refused to eat unless alone. Ellie kept her distance the first few days, walking Max on a separate trail loop. But Shadow noticed him. He watched Max from a distance, didn't react to the barking, didn't retreat from the noise. He simply sat, ears relaxed, posture neutral. Ash did the same. Within a week, Max stopped barking when Shadow was nearby. He still flinched, still paced, but the volume dropped. And eventually, he sat near Ash for the first time. Claire observed the trio one afternoon, Shadow, Ash, and Max walking a portion of the trail in staggered silence. No leashes, no handlers, just presence. She didn't interfere, didn't write it up. She just watched. Because some changes couldn't be measured on paper. They had to be witnessed, felt in the space between what was expected and what simply happened when the pressure was gone. That night, as clouds gathered low over the trees and a warm breeze carried the smell of pine through the fields, Ethan stood on the porch with a quiet awareness settling in. Shadow lay near the steps, breathing slow, eyes half closed. Ash stretched beside him. Max hovered at a distance, unsure but unafraid. No one said anything, no commands, no corrections. Just a quiet understanding that trust, when given space, knew how to speak for itself. It was Ethan who first noticed that visitors started watching Shadow the way Shadow used to watch them. Not with expectation or fear, but with a kind of reverence, as if he had become more than a dog, more than a recovery story. He had become a marker, something solid in a world that felt too uncertain for too long. His presence had grown so gradually that no one could say exactly when it started, but now people paused near him before speaking, lowered their voices when passing, and unconsciously matched his pace when walking the trail. He didn't command attention, he grounded it. Ash had fully grown into himself by then, no longer the skittish pup, but still youthful enough to carry an energy that brightened spaces without disrupting them. His bond with Shadow had matured into something steady. He wasn't just following anymore. He was anchoring, quietly easing new dogs into the flow of the ranch by existing calmly beside them. It was an extension of what Shadow had taught, how to lead by absorbing, not asserting. Claire observed it one afternoon and called it behavioral mentorship without hierarchy. It wasn't training. It was trust passed down through observation. Sarah had begun organizing the data they'd gathered over the past year into something more formal. What started as raw notes and documents had turned into case studies, cross-referenced with facility logs, medical evaluations, and volunteer testimonies. The more they compiled, the clearer the pattern became. The dogs that had been discarded were not too broken. They had simply been asked to survive in systems that never gave them permission to heal. Shadow's story was no longer just about injustice. It had become the control group for what happens when trauma is met with time instead of punishment. One handler who had worked with K-9 units overseas came to visit after reading Sarah's early findings. He brought with him a printed photo of his former partner, a Belgian Malinois named Trigger, who had been deemed too unstable after a blast incident and removed from service. The handler hadn't been able to find him since. He sat with Ethan on the porch for an hour without saying much. Shadow lay nearby, his breathing slow, gaze forward. The man eventually said, "They didn't give him a chance, but they let me keep the medals." He left the photo under the elm tree and drove away without asking for anything else. The porch became a quiet gathering point. Volunteers, adopters, and even passers-by found themselves drawn to it. Not for what happened there, but for what didn't. There were no lectures, no explanations, just presence, just space to be near something that had once been shattered and now radiated stillness. Shadow remained in his usual spot, rarely moving far, but always near. And in his stillness, others found rhythm. Ash began guiding more intentionally. New dogs gravitated toward him instinctively, sensing the absence of demand. They followed without needing to be coaxed. One, a shepherd named Rio, had arrived from a case involving physical abuse. Rio didn't make eye contact for days, but on the fifth morning, he walked behind Ash on the trail, 10 feet back, but following. It was enough. Ethan spent less time fixing fences and more time simply walking the grounds. Not because the work was done, but because the silence was doing more than hammers ever could. He had started to understand that not all protection looked like building barriers. Sometimes it meant creating a space where others could come undone without being seen as failures. At sunset, when the light shifted golden across the field and the dogs settled into their resting spots, Shadow remained the quiet center. He didn't speak. He didn't perform. He didn't seek. He just stayed. And somehow in that stillness, he told the world everything it had been trying to forget about what healing actually looks like. The archive cabin wasn't part of the original design. It had been an afterthought, a converted feed shed with old wooden beams and mismatched windows. But over time, it had grown into something much larger than a building. Inside those walls lived the stories that hadn't made headlines, the ones that came written in pencil on lined paper or scribbled on napkins, folded into envelopes by hands that shook too much to type. Letters arrived from across the country, sometimes from people who had never visited the ranch, but had seen a photograph, read a sentence, heard a name. Most didn't ask for a reply. They only needed to be heard. Sarah managed the space quietly. She didn't catalog by urgency or drama. She filed each letter as it came, in a growing wall of drawers marked only by dates. No summaries, no analysis. The stories stood on their own. One letter came from a child who had lost his therapy dog and wrote, "I think he went to where Shadow is." Another came from a former handler who admitted for the first time in his life that he had nightmares about the command he'd given during a training exercise that ended with a muzzle and silence. These weren't policy cases. They were fragments of grief that had found a safe place to land. Shadow never entered the archive, but his presence was everywhere inside it. His photo, though modestly framed, hung near the back corner, his eyes steady, posture neutral. Visitors often paused in front of it, not to admire, but to acknowledge. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a symbol. He was a dog who had survived the worst parts of human invention and still had something left to offer the world. Claire had added a new section, a binder titled Echo Reports, documenting dogs that had arrived after Shadow and followed similar patterns of withdrawal, reorientation, and recovery. What struck her wasn't just their behavior, but how often they found a mentor without prompting. Ash had now taken on that role completely, his influence clear in the way newer arrivals adjusted their pace to match his, in the way he lingered just long enough near kennels to allow curiosity to overtake fear. She noted that recovery didn't begin with medication or correction, it began with observation. Ethan kept his distance from the archive cabin, not because he didn't care, but because he felt its weight. Every entry reminded him of how deep the roots of this story went. He preferred the trails, the physical work, the routine of repair. But one afternoon, after repairing a section of fence that had bowed under last season's frost, he stepped inside. Sarah looked up but didn't speak. She simply handed him a letter that had come without a return address. It was written in slow, uneven handwriting. It read, "I don't think I'll ever stop feeling guilty. But when I saw that dog's eyes, I thought, for the first time, maybe forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." Ethan folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the box. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Ash had taken to resting by the cabin steps now, not guarding, just present. Visitors often found him there, calm and unmoved by greetings or fuss. One man, who had once worked in an underground training compound, sat beside him for over an hour. When he finally spoke, he said, "They didn't just break dogs, they broke the people too." Ash said nothing, just breathed steady, unbothered. The man stood, wiped his eyes, and walked the trail without looking back. And that was the lesson no one had planned to teach, that sometimes the most powerful form of healing came not through speaking, but through being witnessed in your quietest moment and not being asked to explain a thing. The trail wasn't just a path anymore. It had become a memory loop, not marked by signs, but by footsteps worn deep into the earth by those who needed space to feel something again. Every bend in the trail held its own energy. Near the creek, people often paused without realizing why. At the ridge, they looked outward longer than necessary, and at the elm tree, where the marker sat quiet and unassuming, they lingered in silence. No one was told where to stop or how long to stay. They simply knew. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't worship, it was presence, and for many, that was more than enough. Ash walked the trail each morning, always with a dog behind him, sometimes two. He didn't guide in the traditional sense. He didn't turn to check or signal. He just walked with an energy that welcomed without demanding. New arrivals followed him instinctively. They slowed where he slowed, paused where he paused, and when he stopped by the elm, they waited, even if they didn't understand the reason. What Shadow had once offered Ash now gave freely to others, not as an obligation, but as a rhythm passed down without words. Ethan had started noticing how even the land seemed to absorb what had unfolded over the past year. Grass grew thicker near the resting areas, as if the soil itself had softened. Birds nested closer to the trails. Deer, once rare near the property, were seen grazing not far from the barn. It was as if the ranch had shed its past identity as a rehabilitation center and become something more sacred, a space that held pain without trying to fix it. And in doing so, it had become a place people trusted with their unspoken truths. Claire added benches along the path, spaced far apart so they didn't interrupt the quiet. Each bench was handmade, sanded down to smoothness, without plaques or inscriptions. One was placed near a spot where Shadow had once always paused, the edge of the field where wind met the hill. Visitors found themselves sitting there longer than elsewhere. Ethan sat there sometimes too, not to reflect, but just to watch the light change across the ground, to feel the breeze and remember that healing didn't always mean returning to who you were before. Sometimes it meant becoming someone different without apology. Letters continued to arrive, some physical, some emails, some voice messages recorded with hesitation. One came from a man who had been stationed overseas and witnessed firsthand how dogs were used in ways no one talked about. He wrote, "We weren't told what would happen to them when they stopped being useful. Now I can't stop seeing their faces. Another came from a teenage girl who had never known war or policy, but had adopted a senior rescue dog who wouldn't enter rooms with closed doors. She wrote, "He just needed to know the door would open again. That was all." Sarah cataloged every story, but she no longer tried to fit them into categories. Some stories didn't have themes or conclusions. They just needed to be heard. The trail reflected that same philosophy. It didn't promise transformation. It offered motion, movement without pressure, and for many who had spent years stuck in cycles of grief or guilt or confusion, that was the first real freedom they'd felt in a long time. That evening, as dusk fell across the property and golden light poured between the trees, Ethan stood by the elm tree and looked down at the marker. It hadn't changed, just one word carved clean and without flourish. He reached down, brushed away a few fallen leaves, and placed a smooth riverstone beside it. No ceremony, no words, just a gesture. Then he turned and walked the trail, Ash following at his side, and two new dogs trailing close behind, their feet finding rhythm in soil that had learned how to hold pain and let it pass. By midsummer, the ranch had settled into something more than routine. It had become a rhythm that didn't need direction. Dogs woke with the sun, volunteers moved quietly through chores, and Ash began each day with his usual walk to the ridge. What had once required intention now happened organically. The ranch no longer felt like a place where healing occurred. It felt like a place where healing lived. There was no schedule posted, no bells, just a steady hum of movement shaped by compassion and the quiet understanding that progress had its own pace. Ash had grown into a presence that needed no announcement. His influence wasn't in volume or dominance, but in the gentle way he made space for others to exist. A new arrival named Riley, a sleek, nervous pointer with a history of forced aggression drills, had refused to leave the kennel for 4 straight days. No amount of coaxing or food made a difference, but Ash began lying just outside the gate each morning. Not watching, not waiting, just present. By day 5, Riley stepped out on his own and walked 2 steps behind Ash down the trail, head low, tail still. No one spoke about it. They just watched and let it happen. Claire began keeping quieter notes now. Her formal logs remained accurate, but she started a second journal, one filled with observations that had no place in clinical evaluations. She wrote about the way dogs adjusted their breathing near Ash, how they mirrored his posture, how they seemed to find calm just by being near him. She called it ambient regulation, and while it wouldn't pass peer-reviewed scrutiny, she knew what she was seeing. It was healing, not forced, only invited. Sarah finalized a partnership with 2 animal welfare organizations to share what they learned, not in the form of a program or product, but as a philosophy. The shadow standard, as it had come to be called in quiet circles, wasn't a training method. It was a framework that placed stillness before strategy, trust before tasks. A small team from one of the shelters came to observe, expecting protocols and procedures. What they found instead was a trail, a porch, and a dog who walked slowly enough for broken things to follow him home. Ethan kept working the land. He didn't speak much at meetings or during briefings. His work was in the soil, in the way he maintained the spaces where these transformations could happen. He rebuilt part of the barn walkway that summer, reinforcing it not because it was falling apart, but because he didn't want a single foot to land on anything unstable. That to him was the work, to ensure that the ground beneath those trying to heal never gave way. One night after a rainstorm softened the fields and made the sky smell like wet cedar, Ethan stood on the porch and looked out at the trail. Ash was there, sitting at the fork between the outer loop and the short walk to the elm. A young hound stood behind him, unsure. Ash didn't move. He didn't nudge or lead. He just waited. After a long pause, the hound chose the longer path. Ash followed, and in that moment, Ethan understood what had really happened here. This wasn't about rescue. It wasn't about recovery. It was about giving someone enough space to decide which direction to go, and then walking beside them, not ahead, not above, but beside. That was the legacy Shadow had left, and that was the lesson Ash had inherited. You don't lead by pulling someone forward. You lead by standing still long enough for them to catch up. The heat of late summer brought a kind of stillness that settled over the ranch like a blanket. The wind slowed, the dogs rested longer in the shade, and even the morning routines adjusted to the rising temperatures. But despite the quiet, nothing felt idle. The ranch breathed differently now, not with urgency, but with understanding. The work didn't stop, it simply softened. Even progress moved slower, but it moved. And for Ethan, that was enough. Movement wasn't the measure anymore. Presence was. Ash had become a fixture on the porch, not because he was tired or fading, but because he had learned where his energy was needed most. Dogs passed him like checkpoints, brushing against his side or pausing beside him without prompt. Visitors often sat near him too, saying little. Sometimes they asked questions about Shadow. Ethan never gave rehearsed answers. He just told them what he remembered, how Shadow had arrived silent, how he had listened before he trusted, how his legacy wasn't in what he overcame, but in how he remained. The trail saw more use now. People came not to be guided, but to walk with intention. No signs told them what to do. Yet still they moved with care, slowing near the elm, lingering near the ridge. There were more stones at the base of the marker now, smooth river rocks, painted pieces, and one wooden tag engraved with the words "safe." No one kept count. The accumulation felt natural, like grief honoring grief, hope laying itself gently at the feet of someone who had once held it for them. Claire began training a new veterinary assistant, a young woman named Lily who had worked in urban shelters and seen more pain in 3 years than most did in 10. Lily asked hard questions, but she listened carefully. Claire didn't give her protocol, she gave her presence. One afternoon, Lily watched Ash approach a dog named Miko, who had spent the first week growling at corners and refusing to eat. Ash didn't do anything remarkable. He just lay down in Miko's line of sight, not facing him, not watching. Within 10 minutes, Miko stepped forward. Lily wrote in her notebook. He made space instead of offering help, and it worked. Sarah received an invitation to speak at a national conference on trauma-informed animal care. She declined the keynote but sent a letter instead. In it, she wrote, "We did not build a model to be copied. We lived a story that others may choose to listen to." The letter was read aloud on the final day. The room fell silent, and afterwards someone sent a note saying, "We've been training dogs to listen. We never stopped to listen to them." Ethan continued walking the property, repairing what needed tending, sharpening tools, clearing fallen branches. He passed Ash on the trail one morning and paused as the dog stood watching a young collie hesitate at a bend in the path. Ash didn't signal. He didn't bark or glance back. He simply stood until the collie caught up and then moved forward again. Ethan smiled and kept walking. That was what leadership looked like here now. Not instruction, but invitation. That evening, as dusk painted the fields in gold and the barn lights blinked on one by one, Ethan sat on the porch beside Ash. The sounds were soft, footsteps on gravel, a low breeze through the trees, a door clicking shut gently in the distance. Ethan didn't speak. Ash didn't stir. But both of them were listening, not for anything specific, but for the space between stories, the quiet where the next one would begin. By early fall, the air changed. Mornings came slower, with mist curling along the ground like breath from the earth itself. The trees whispered differently. Leaves shifted from green to gold, and the trail softened beneath feet in paws that now walked it without hesitation. It had been a year since Shadow first stood on that porch, watching without trust, listening without hope. And though his body was no longer there, everything he had taught still moved through the land like an invisible current, shaping every silence into something sacred. Ash had grown more reflective. He still led the morning walks, still greeted new arrivals with calm attention, but he took longer pauses now, at bends in the trail, at the porch steps, under the elm. He seemed to sense that something larger than memory had been left behind. He wasn't trying to replace anything. He was continuing it. Visitors noticed his stillness and often stayed longer near him than they planned. Some knelt down and said nothing. Others whispered thanks, and a few simply sat beside him, leaving behind no words at all, just the weight of their presence. Ethan had started receiving letters addressed not to him, but to the ranch. Some came with no names at all, just stories, some typed, some handwritten, folded between drawings or dog tags or photos of aging pets whose eyes looked like they had seen too much and forgiven anyway. One envelope contained a collar, no note, just the collar and a small, smooth pebble painted with a paw print. He added it to the growing collection at the base of the elm tree, where legacy now rested beneath the roots of silence. Claire noticed that the dogs were adjusting faster. Those who once would have taken weeks to emerge from the shadows were now stepping into the open within days. She credited Ash, but she also recognized something deeper: the emotional architecture built by what had already happened. The ranch itself was doing part of the work now. The rhythm, the tone, the people, the dogs, all of it formed a space where fear wasn't corrected, but accepted, allowed to melt without being named. Sarah stepped back from most public outreach. She felt the story had spoken what it needed to say. There were still requests for interviews, inquiries about replication, offers for funding expansions, but she declined most of them. The story wasn't scalable, it was personal. It couldn't be turned into a system without losing the very soul that made it matter. Instead, she helped smaller sanctuaries find their own rhythm, not by handing them a blueprint, but by reminding them that every place of healing had to be rooted in its own soil. On a quiet evening, Ethan sat near the fire pit, watching the last orange light bleed across the horizon. Ash rested at his feet. A few dogs milled nearby, not tense, not tired, just at ease. The kind of ease that came only after enough time passed without pain. Ethan thought of Shadow, of the first night they shared this porch, of the way silence had stretched so far between them it had almost collapsed. And now that same silence was filled with meaning. It had become something sacred. He didn't speak, but he picked up a stick and tossed it gently toward the edge of the field. Ash didn't chase it. He looked, stood, and walked toward it, but not to fetch, just to observe. He stopped beside it and lay down, eyes on the tree line, chest rising slow. Ethan nodded once, as if some unseen conversation had been completed without words. The things that stay with us the longest are often the things we never expected to carry, and sometimes what begins as survival becomes a legacy, not because it was planned, but because someone stayed long enough for it to matter. Winter came gently that year, arriving not with snowstorms or sudden frost, but with a hush that blanketed the hills in muted colors. The light dimmed earlier each day, and the mornings took longer to arrive. Still, nothing about the ranch felt heavy. It moved at a slower pace, yes, but with intention. Dogs slept longer, volunteers spoke less, and the wind that passed through the trees carried a different kind of silence, one not filled with absence, but with memory. Everything still bore the echo of Shadow, but not in a way that hurt. His presence had evolved into something quieter, something woven into the fabric of the land itself. Ash adapted without resistance. He took longer to move between tasks but never rushed. His leadership had deepened, less energetic now but more grounded. Dogs responded to him not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. He had lived through the change. He had inherited something intangible from a dog who never asked to be followed, only watched. And now Ash had become that same steady point for others. The figure dogs turned toward in uncertainty, the one they trusted to be still when everything else felt unstable. Ethan spent more time walking the trails alone, sometimes before sunrise, sometimes just before dusk. He didn't walk to remember or reflect. He walked because the trail had become part of him. Its bends and shadows, its soft turns near the creek, its rise toward the ridge. Every step felt familiar, and every step reminded him that some stories don't end. They just change forms. The land held too many footprints to be cleared now. It had become a living archive, and walking it felt like reading a story he'd once written without knowing how important it would become. Visitors continued to come, though fewer in number. Those who did arrive rarely stayed long. They came for moments, an hour near the porch, a walk around the loop, a quiet pause near the elm. They didn't ask for guides or tours. They didn't expect lessons. They came for the same reason Ethan had once stayed, for something wordless that waited patiently until they were ready to meet it. Often they left quietly, sometimes with tears, sometimes just with slower breathing. One letter arrived from a military base in Texas, asking permission to name their new canine rehab wing Shadow Hall. Ethan read it twice, then placed it on the table without a reply. Not because he didn't care, but because he wasn't sure if Shadow's name should belong to anyone else. But Sarah read the letter later and said, without prompting, "It's not his name they want, it's his proof." That night, Ethan sent a quiet email with a single line. "You can use the name if you carry it with the weight it deserves." Claire had begun teaching again, small groups at first, students and young vets who wanted to learn more than textbook medicine. She didn't lecture. She let them observe. And often what they learned wasn't from her at all. It was from Ash, from the dogs who had learned to settle in their own time, from the trail that taught rhythm better than any clock. Her notes became less clinical, more reflective. She once wrote, "We don't treat symptoms here. We recognize stories and wait for trust to return." And every evening, as the light slipped behind the hills and the dogs circled into rest, Ash returned to the porch, sometimes lying beneath the bench where Shadow had once slept, sometimes stretching out along the steps. He never looked back before settling. He simply knew where to be. And Ethan, standing quietly in the doorway, knew the same. The name Shadow had never been just a label. It had become a shape the world stepped into, one quiet moment at a time. Spring arrived slowly, peeling back the cold with soft light and a gentler wind. The ranch felt different, not new but lighter, as if it had exhaled something it had held for too long. The dogs sensed it first, waking earlier, wandering further, testing the edges of the space that had once held so much hesitation. Ash resumed his morning patrols with quiet certainty, no longer tracing another dog's path, but walking his own. He didn't need to be watched now. He had become the one others watched. And in his quiet leadership, the ranch found a rhythm that didn't need correction. It simply flowed. Visitors still came, but their reasons had shifted. Fewer arrived out of curiosity. More came with purpose. Some brought stories, others brought silence. One woman drove from 3 states away with a photograph of her father's service dog who had vanished during reassignment. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat under the elm tree for an hour, placed the photo beneath a stone, and left without a word. Ethan saw her from a distance and didn't approach. He understood. The tree had become something sacred now, not because of the marker, but because so many had chosen it as the place where they could finally put something down. Sarah began organizing a community program. Not large-scale, not formal, but a network of people who had experienced what the ranch represented and wanted to replicate it in their own quiet way. She called it the Listening Line. It wasn't a nonprofit. It wasn't even a business. It was a practice. An agreement between strangers to meet animals and people where they were instead of where the world expected them to be. Some created small sanctuaries. Others simply changed how they interacted with the one dog they had at home. One woman wrote, "I stopped correcting my dog's fear. I started sitting with it. That's when she came closer." Claire, meanwhile, focused on mentorship. New interns arrived each season, bright, eager, and often rigid from systems that rewarded speed over presence. She taught them how to observe rather than intervene, how to notice breath patterns and weight shifts, how to wait before touching. Most found it difficult at first, but those who stayed long enough learned that healing wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It often looked like nothing, until everything changed. Ethan kept the ground steady. He repaired fencing, oiled hinges, cleared debris from the creek. He moved without fanfare. His days were marked not by tasks but by proximity, to the land, to the dogs, to the people who needed somewhere to just be. One afternoon, he noticed a new arrival, a shepherd mix who wouldn't leave the shade near the transport gate. Ash approached, lay down nearby, and waited. For over 2 hours, he stayed there. Eventually, the dog stood, shook off, and walked 5 steps forward. Ethan saw it and didn't celebrate. He just kept walking. That evening, after most had gone to sleep, Ethan sat on the porch with Ash at his feet. A breeze moved through the trees, soft and slow. He thought about Shadow, not with grief, but with gratitude. So much had begun with one dog's silence. So much had changed without a speech, without a plan, just presence. And now that presence lived on, not as a statue, not as a slogan, but as a way of being. Ash lifted his head, blinked once, and rested it again. No sound broke the moment. No cue ended it. It passed like all things did at the ranch, without command, without spectacle, without rush. Just time, moving forward, gently carrying the legacy of a dog who had once stood in the doorway of his own fear and waited long enough for someone to understand him. The days that followed didn't feel like endings. They felt like transitions, moments quietly slipping from one form into another. There was no single event that marked the shift, no announcement, no change in schedule, just the subtle recognition that Shadow's absence had become presence in another shape. His name was spoken less, not because he was forgotten, but because what he had given was now embedded in everything. The trail, the porch, the way the dogs lay with their backs exposed, trusting the ground beneath them. He didn't need to be mentioned to be known. He was there in the rhythm. Ash carried the weight differently now. He still led, still watched, still waited when needed. But there was a new kind of steadiness in the way he moved, as if the quiet had taught him something even deeper than behavior. He had learned not just when to pause, but when to stay still long enough for someone else to breathe through their fear. Dogs followed him because he asked nothing of them. He gave his attention freely, and that offering, without condition, was its own kind of leadership. Claire had begun writing a paper she never intended to publish. It was more a meditation than a study. Pages filled with observations, reflections, moments too fragile for journals or conferences. She titled it, "The Space Between Commands." In it, she wrote about how trust wasn't built through repetition or reward, but through waiting. She described how Ash's stillness calmed cortisol spikes faster than any sedative, how dogs that had bitten their previous handlers began relaxing within days, not because they were trained to, but because no one demanded it from them here. The ranch hadn't changed the dogs. It had changed the expectations. Sarah added a final drawer to the archive, marked only with the letter S. It held nothing but handwritten letters, stories sent from shelters and military bases, from families and individuals who had known dogs like Shadow, but never had the words to describe what those animals carried. One note simply said, "He reminded me that I wasn't broken, just tired." Another enclosed a photograph of an old kennel with the door open, captioned only, "We waited this time." Ethan began clearing a new section of trail, not because the others had worn thin, but because he sensed it was time. The new path curved gently around the back of the ridge, where the trees were thinner and the light lasted longer. It wasn't meant to replace anything. It was meant to offer a new direction for those who needed one. As he worked, Ash followed, resting nearby as branches were cleared and soil was packed. On the final day of work, Ash walked the full length of the path without pause. At the far end, he stopped, looked back, and sat. Later that evening, Ethan placed a stone at the trail's entrance. Not large, not inscribed, just smooth, rounded by years of water and weather. He didn't explain its meaning to anyone. He didn't need to. Those who walked the path would know. The same way they knew what the elm meant, what the porch represented, what the pause before the bend in the trail was for. These weren't places. They were conversations left open. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the fields, Ash returned to the porch and curled beside the bench. Ethan sat nearby, hands resting on his knees, breath steady. Nothing about the moment demanded reflection, but everything in it invited it. There was no sadness, only the soft weight of legacy, the kind that doesn't sit heavy on your shoulders, but lives quietly in the soles of your feet, reminding you where to step and why. Autumn crept in with a quiet confidence, painting the hills in muted gold and rust. The days grew shorter, but they felt no less full. The ranch adjusted without resistance. Routines softened, footsteps slowed, and the porch once again became the center of gravity. No one spoke of changes, no meetings were held, yet everyone moved with a shared understanding that time was passing, but what had been built here didn't age the way most things did. It settled deeper instead of fading. It planted itself. Ash took to the new trail often, not with the urgency of exploration, but with the kind of certainty that comes when a place already feels familiar before you've walked it. Dogs followed as they always had, not because they were told to, but because he had become the one they trusted to choose the quietest path. He walked slowly now, measured and intentional, his body more relaxed, his gaze less vigilant. He no longer looked back to see if he was being followed. He simply walked, and others came. Claire noted the subtle differences in the dogs that arrived now. They recovered faster, not because their trauma was less severe, but because the environment expected less of them. She believed healing was not about time, but about pressure, or more precisely, the absence of it. When no one rushed the process began on its own. She adjusted her approach too. Fewer assessments, more observation. Her notes became smaller, more precise. She found that a single sentence could often hold more truth than an entire evaluation form. Sarah expanded the listening line into something more fluid. Instead of chapters or branches, she encouraged people to think of it as a current, a slow-moving river of practice and patience. She compiled quiet testimonies, quotes from volunteers, moments from visitors that hadn't been shared publicly. One man wrote, "I stopped trying to fix my dog. I started trying to listen the way he does." Another shared a single sentence, "I breathe differently now." Sarah didn't organize them. She simply placed them into a long, continuous document, an archive without edges. Ethan spent most days between the workshop and the fields. His hands stayed busy, his steps purposeful, but every so often he'd pause and look out toward the porch or the elm or the ridge and feel something land quietly inside him. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't even pride. It was more like confirmation, proof that the smallest decisions, the quietest moments, had built something that no storm could take down. Shadow had never known what he'd started, but Ethan did now. He saw it every day. One morning, just before the frost returned to the grass, Ash lay beneath the porch bench longer than usual. A young lab mix named Finn approached him, cautiously at first, then lay beside him with a sigh so heavy it seemed to come from years of silence. Ethan watched from the steps, arms folded, breath misting in the cold. No one said anything. Ash didn't move, but something important had happened. A transfer, a handoff of calm that would never show up in a report, but would echo in the way Finn walked the trail from then on. That night, the wind picked up and scattered leaves across the path. Ethan raked them without hurry. Ash followed slowly behind, not out of duty but presence. The porch light glowed against the barn wall, and the sound of dogs breathing filled the air like music. Ethan didn't feel like the story was ending. If anything, it felt more alive now than ever, stretched across time, embedded in trees, in trails, and the places where quiet things had been allowed to speak. And beneath it all, what remained wasn't just memory, it was stillness that had learned how to grow. The first snow arrived without warning, just a soft dusting overnight, thin enough to melt by noon, but enough to coat the trails in silence. It wasn't the kind of storm that disrupted life on the ranch. It was the kind that reminded everyone to slow down. The dogs responded instinctively. Their steps grew more careful, their barks less frequent. Even the wind seemed to move with restraint, drifting low and soft between the fence posts. The porch light stayed on longer each morning, casting a warm glow that felt less like a signal and more like a promise. You are still home here. Ash had grown older. His body moved differently now, not stiff, just slower, as though he had learned not to waste steps. He still walked the trail, but his loops had shortened. He chose routes with less incline, paused longer at the bends. No one forced him forward. No one measured his pace. They simply adjusted around him, and that adjustment spoke more of leadership than any command ever had. The dogs followed at his tempo. The volunteers did too. There was something sacred about letting time shape the pace instead of ambition. Claire noticed that Ash's presence had begun doing something subtle. He was shaping emotional tone before anyone spoke. If he entered a space and lay down, the volume in that room naturally dropped. If he rested outside the kennel of a reactive dog, the barking slowed. She didn't teach it. He didn't learn it. It had become part of who he was. He carried Shadow's energy now, not in mimicry, but in purpose. It was no longer about what had been passed down. It was about what had taken root. Ethan added insulation to the cabin that month, hammering boards while snow fell lightly beyond the window. He didn't mind the cold. It made him pay attention. Every nail driven into wood felt like a punctuation mark, proof that things were still being built, even when no one was watching. He didn't need applause. The quiet itself had become its own kind of affirmation. Each board he placed reminded him that even in stillness, you could shape a future. Sarah read through the latest letters in the archive, scanning pages that arrived with no return address, some smudged with weather, others folded like secrets. One from a former police officer stood out. It read, "I trained them to obey. You taught me what happens when we give them time to think." Another came from a girl in foster care who had rescued a neglected terrier. Her note said, "He shakes when I speak, so now I whisper. It helps both of us." Sarah didn't respond to most letters. She simply added them to the growing stack, each one a quiet testimony that the story had rippled far beyond the gate. That evening, as the sky shifted to that deep blue-black shade just before the stars emerged, Ash curled beneath the porch bench. The porch light above him flickered once, then held steady. Ethan sat beside him, mug in hand, the steam rising in slow spirals. Neither of them moved for a long time. The air didn't need words. The moment was enough. In that silence, Ethan thought not of legacy or timelines or what came next. He thought of how it all began, with one dog, broken but breathing, standing at the edge of trust. And now, years later, beneath the same porch light, the trust had become something so much larger. Not an act, not a project, but a living, breathing truth. One that didn't shout, didn't sell, didn't demand attention. It simply stayed. And sometimes, staying was the greatest thing you could offer the world. The snow came heavier in the following weeks, blanketing the hills in silence and pushing the world inward. The trail disappeared under soft drifts, but the path remained clear to those who knew it. Ash still walked it, slower now, more cautious, but with the same quiet conviction. He didn't lead as much as he accompanied, allowing younger dogs to pass him when they were ready, stepping aside rather than pressing forward. His leadership had become an offering, not a position, and that offering held weight even when he stood still. One morning, a new dog arrived, an older hound named Barrett, whose file was thin, but whose eyes were heavy with something unspoken. He refused to enter the main kennel area, choosing instead to pace the fence line, tail low, breath fast. Volunteers tried treats, soft voices, distance. Nothing helped, but Ash, without instruction, walked slowly across the yard and lay down in Barrett's line of sight. Not facing him, not watching him, just present. Hours passed like that. And then without prompt, Barrett stopped pacing. He didn't approach. He didn't submit. He simply stopped and sat. Claire saw it happen and made no note. There was nothing clinical to log, no intervention to record. She simply paused what she was doing, breathed in the cold air, and watched two dogs existing beside each other. Proof that healing wasn't always an action. Sometimes it was the absence of one. Sarah began preparing a small collection of entries from the archive. She didn't call it a book. There were no plans to publish. It was simply something she wanted to hold, a record of what had happened here, not for the world, but for the people who had made it, for the volunteers who had stayed through storms, for the families who had written in. Grief and left with something softer in return. She titled it, "They Didn't Leave Broken." That was the whole point. Ethan cleared the new trail loop with a shovel and a steady breath. He didn't rush. He moved the snow as if it were something sacred. The dogs followed him in single file, quiet and close. At one point he stopped, rested his hand on Ash's shoulder, and just stood there while the wind stirred gently through the trees. He thought about how much had changed, how much hadn't, and how grateful he was that this place had never needed to become anything other than what it already was. The porch had grown quieter too, not empty, but content. There were fewer questions now, fewer worries. The dogs knew the rhythm. They trusted the space. Ash rested more than before, choosing his spots carefully, curling beside the bench or beneath the railing, always close enough to feel the warmth of the home they'd built together. One evening after the last dog had been fed and the sky turned to velvet, Ethan sat beside Ash on the porch and watched the snow fall in slow motion. It didn't feel cold. It felt peaceful, like the land was finally catching up to the silence they had worked so hard to protect. Ash breathed deeply beside him, no tension in his body, no need to guard. Just rest. And Ethan understood then that the story didn't need to be told any louder. It didn't need to be written into policy or carved into stone. It had already left its mark, in dogs that now approach without fear, in people who stayed longer than they expected, in a trail that curved just enough to let someone choose a different direction without being asked why. The dogs remembered. Not in words or commands, but in behavior, in breath, in the way they stepped forward after years of standing still. And as long as they remembered, the story would never disappear. As the days grew longer and the snow began to recede from the trail edges, there was a calm that settled into the bones of the ranch. It wasn't the calm that comes from nothing happening. It was the kind that comes from everything being in its place. The land didn't buzz with movement, it breathed. Even the birds returned slowly, their calls softer, as if reluctant to disrupt the rhythm that had taken hold in winter's absence. Life resumed, but it didn't rush. It never had to hear. Ash continued his walks, though they shortened with each passing week. He no longer led every loop, and no one expected him to. Younger dogs had begun to step forward, tentatively at first, then with more certainty. One in particular, a dark-eyed mutt named Theo, started initiating the early trail walks. Theo didn't have Ash's stillness or Shadow's precision, but he carried a kind of grounded energy, always looking back to check who followed, always adjusting his steps to whoever lagged. It wasn't training, it was inheritance passed without instruction. Claire watched from a distance and saw the cycle repeating itself, not as a pattern of behavior, but as a legacy of attention. Each dog that had come through the ranch had left behind something unseen: energy, rhythm, trust layered over trust like rings in a tree trunk. Theo was the newest ring, not the center, but the continuation. Claire smiled at the thought. She updated her notes that evening, writing simply, "The method is not to intervene, it's to witness." Ethan repaired the bench near the ridge one afternoon, sanding down a worn slat, replacing a rusted screw. Ash sat nearby, his body stretched along the sun-warmed dirt, eyes half closed. He didn't watch Ethan. He didn't need to. Their connection no longer depended on presence. It had moved into something quieter, an understanding forged over years of silent work. When the job was done, Ethan sat beside him and rested his hands in his lap. No words were exchanged. Nothing needed to be said. Sarah began preparing a seasonal gathering for the first time. Nothing formal, no invitations or itinerary. Just a day where those who had walked the trail, written letters, or sent stories could arrive if they wanted to. There would be no speeches, just time, just space. A few had already RSVP'd without prompting, some saying they were bringing their dogs, others simply wanting to walk the property alone. Sarah didn't plan beyond that. She didn't need to. The land would hold what it needed to. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the golden light returned to the field like a long-lost friend, Ash rose slowly and walked the trail. Theo followed, a few paces behind, matching his speed. At one point, they both stopped near the bend that curved just past the elm. Ash stood still for a long moment, then looked back, not to command, not to check, but to offer something wordless. Theo met his gaze, then stepped forward. Not ahead of Ash, not behind, beside him. From the porch, Ethan watched and understood. This was how it always worked, not with declarations or assignments, but through example, repeated enough times, that it became part of someone else's instinct. Shadow had taught without speaking. Ash had carried that silence forward. And now Theo was learning it not by study, but by standing near it long enough to recognize its value. In this place, leadership was never taken. It was absorbed, passed along like breath in cold air, visible for only a moment, then felt long after it disappeared. By the time spring unfolded fully across the fields, the ranch had grown into something that no longer needed to explain itself. The people who came through the gates didn't ask about programs or policies anymore. They didn't need tours or orientation. They stepped onto the gravel path and paused, not from confusion, but from recognition. It felt like a place they had been looking for, even if they didn't know it until they arrived. And what they found wasn't structure or strategy, it was rhythm. A rhythm held in the way dogs moved, in the way the wind curved around the elm, in the way the porch light stayed on just a little longer than necessary each night. Theo had started taking the morning lead, his path slightly more winding than Ash's had been. He didn't walk in straight lines. He drifted a bit, circling back often, as if checking not just who followed, but how they were doing. He was less precise than Ash and far less still, but something in his pace offered space, and the dogs responded. They didn't rush to follow him. They followed when they were ready, which meant they stayed because they chose to. That, Ethan thought, was the entire point. Ash still walked the trail, but not daily. Some mornings he rested near the porch steps, blinking slowly in the rising light, content to let others carry what he once held. And no one questioned it. The work had shifted, not because he had stepped back, but because his presence had been transferred without ceremony. He had done what Shadow had done before him, led with such consistency that others learned without realizing they were learning. And now he rested. Not because he was tired, because the story had moved forward. Claire updated the recovery logs less frequently. She had started measuring success in different ways. How long a new dog stayed outside without retreating, how often they blinked while resting, whether they sat beside someone without touch. Small things, invisible to most. But to her, they were the metrics of something real. Not obedience, not reactivity, just peace returning in slow, fragile steps. Sarah received a letter that week from a man who had driven through the state with no intention of stopping. He said he pulled over when he saw the fence line, unsure why, and walked the outer trail with his rescue dog. No staff spoke to him, no dog approached. But when he left, he wrote, "I don't know what this place is, but my dog looked me in the eye when we got back in the truck. He's never done that before." Sarah didn't reply. She added the letter to the archive. Some acknowledgments didn't need responses. They just needed to be held. Ethan cleared the last bit of debris from the far end of the trail loop and stood there longer than usual. From that spot, you could see almost everything. The barn, the porch, the ridge. He remembered the early days, the uncertainty, the weight of trying to get it all right. And now there was no anxiety, just motion, just trust. The ranch didn't need steering anymore. It knew where to go. That evening, Ash walked the edge of the field with slow steps, pausing every few yards, not to sniff or scout, but to watch the wind move through the grass. Theo joined him halfway, bumping his shoulder once before continuing ahead. Ash didn't follow immediately. He sat, and in that pause, the entire story lived. Everything they'd built, everything they'd carried, now moving into someone else's hands, someone else's pause, someone else's breath. What Shadow began hadn't ended with Ash. It hadn't ended at all. It had changed forms, passed quietly from one presence to the next, each one softer, more patient, less in need of being understood. Because here, understanding didn't come from words. It came from staying long enough to hear what silence sounds like when it finally feels safe. The last light of spring lingered longer than expected, stretching across the fields like it had forgotten winter altogether. Days ended slower. Shadows took their time rising from the earth. The air smelled of pine and soil and warmth that hadn't been felt in years. But nothing about the ranch felt finished. In fact, the absence of urgency made it clear that this was not the end of anything. If anything, it was the full arrival of something that had been growing quietly beneath the surface for a very long time. Ash spent more time resting now, not in retreat, but in rhythm. He chose his moments carefully, rising only when needed, walking only when it mattered. He was no longer the center of the movement, but he remained its pulse. Theo had taken on most of the trail walks, though his path was looser, more expressive. He didn't replace Ash. He never could. But he extended the story, letting it grow in a different direction without ever breaking its shape. Dogs continued to follow because they felt seen. That had always been the difference. Here, survival didn't demand silence. It invited it to speak. Visitors still arrived, though the ranch never advertised. They came with questions they didn't know how to ask, and most left with answers they didn't need to explain. Some left behind collars. Some brought stones for the elm. A few simply walked the loop once, sat beside the porch for an hour, and left with something changed in their posture. Shoulders looser, steps slower, breath returned. No one documented those moments. That was never the point. What mattered was that they happened. Sarah finalized a small booklet of excerpts from the archive, not to publish, but to place in the reflection room. It held quotes from letters, journal entries, notes scrawled on paper napkins. Some were raw, some poetic. One simply said, "He let me sit beside him when I couldn't speak." That was the first time I felt real again. The booklet had no author, no title, just pages of truth that didn't need credit to carry weight. Claire retired the intake protocols altogether. There were no more tests on arrival, no assigned temperament charts. Dogs came as they were. The staff watched, waited, adjusted, and healing came faster, not because it was forced, but because it was trusted. One vet intern wrote in her notes, "We don't fix anything here. We just remove the fear and let the dog decide who they want to be." That line stayed with Claire longer than she expected. She didn't correct it. She underlined it. Ethan started planting trees near the outer trail. Small ones, strong ones. Not to mark territory, not to name anything. Just to grow something that would stay long after he was gone. Each one was placed with quiet intention. Ash followed him out each morning, sometimes sitting in the shade of the youngest tree, sometimes digging a little beside him before flopping down in the dirt like the job had been done. Ethan smiled at that. No fanfare, just shared labor, just time. One evening, as the sky turned to lavender and the last light melted across the hills, Ethan stood at the edge of the field. Ash lay near the bench. Theo trotted along the trail with a small group of new arrivals behind him, and everything felt still, not because nothing moved, but because nothing needed to. The story had become the space. It no longer belonged to one dog, one man, one moment. It belonged to every breath taken without fear, every step made without command, every silence that had finally been heard. And in that silence, something eternal settled, not as a monument, but as a memory that never stopped walking. Because what Shadow gave them wasn't just a second chance. It was the blueprint for how to stay, even after you're gone.